today I'm joined by Professor Salvatore Stolfo, who is also the CTO at Allure Security and Columbia University professor. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
Now, Sal, my understanding is that you're very heavily involved. You've been involved in R&D of finding new ways to solve web spoofing as part of an orchestrated phishing attack, where the attackers are exploiting customers' trust and well-established brands to carry out these large-scale phishing attacks. And oftentimes, of course, it comes in the form of emails claiming to be from the trusted brands, and they want you to click on a link that then takes them to a very convincing but a fake site where customers are prompted to enter their credentials or maybe reset their passwords. Now, of course, these attacks put a high stake for companies because it risks their brand reputation as well as potential lost trust and fines, especially in light of privacy compliance such as GDPR and how companies are navigating some of these things. Why is this such a huge issue, and do you feel like the companies right now are doing enough?
So, excellent question. Are they doing enough? No. They are investing quite a bit in deploying technology to solve, but partially solve, the phishing problem for their own employees, so that employees are tricked into giving up their credentials. Then attackers have access to the corporate network, and that's very bad. But when it comes to customers, you are not an employee of an enterprise. There are precious few alternatives. When you have an employee, you as a large enterprise can filter their email traffic. You can look at their email messages and determine if there's for example, a malicious link. So you can filter that. You have control over the email. If an employee does click on a link, you can train them. You can send them to training to say you should inspect this in the email message and inspect the URL and so forth. You have control over the environment that the employee is using. You don't have that control over a customer. The relationships we have with our banks, for example, they can't filter my emails. They can't filter your email. They can't train us. And so we fall prey to these kinds of attacks without the kinds of support that employees of enterprises have with the enterprise. For the first time, we are addressing that issue. You and I and everybody else listening to this has relationships with a large number of organizations that we interact with. When their sites get spoofed and we are victimized, who do you blame? Well, clearly the enterprise that we have the relationship with is going to be first in line. Mm-hmm. You should have stopped this spoofing. So brand and brand reputation is at risk, great risk for these kinds of attacks. The other as well, of course, is when you do get tricked, you do provide your credentials to the attacker. The attacker now has access to whatever your relationship is with that enterprise, your Amazon Prime account or your bank account. And that now is lost, data lost to the enterprise. When it comes to GDPR, it's crystal clear that the responsibility for protecting customer data is on the enterprise that has the relationship with the customer. So even if the customer is independently tricked, independently giving up their data, the trick was because the enterprise's website was spoofed. And that is the responsibility of the enterprise to do the best they can, best practice that they can to protect the customer. But at Allure, we are providing the opportunity to detect the spoof site in real time as quickly as is possible. And by detecting the spoof site before the campaign starts, before the phishing campaign starts, to bring it down, that protects the customer and the customer's data. Furthermore, this is one of the innovations of our technology. In the period of time it takes to take down a spoof site, you may not be able to take it down because it may be operated by a server that's being hosted by an ISP that's not very friendly, maybe in a foreign venue, in which case it may operate for a long period of time. While it's operating, many victims have been sent to that site, tricked to go to that site and give up their credentials. So what we do at Allure is when we find that site, when we detect it, we visit the site and we provide fake user information, decoy credentials, in which case now the attacker who's gathering victim credentials, they're also gathering decoy credentials. And now you have a database of usernames and passwords. Which ones are the real ones? Which ones are the fake ones? The attacker now has a daunting task. We've just devalued what they have stolen. And now they have the problem. If I try to sell it, most of what I'm selling is bogus garbage. So it's really not going to be valuable that much. So why bother doing it? And furthermore, if I want to filter out the deceptive decoy credentials that we have fed them, now they have to test it. How would you test whether something is fake or real? You'd have to go back to the original site that they spoofed in the first place. And if they use the decoy credential, we will know and we will gather data about them. So they risk now being detected as who they are or what set of resources that they use when they're attacking sites. So they have a daunting task. My view is this is probably the best solution to stopping phishing in scale. And the best way to stop it is to change the economics, make it no longer valuable to the attackers, in which case, don't bother doing it. Go find a job and do something else that's much more productive.
All right, so just for the audience, just to kind of frame it up and take a step back and provide a little bit of context, is that traditionally detecting spoofing meant that they would focus on monitoring domain registrations, manual web service searches, looking for maybe their brand images or maybe relevant content that's related to that brand. And then certainly, of course, training employees that can spot for fake websites. Now, what you're advocating is this use of AI plus the deception technology that was birthed out of the Columbia University's Intrusion Detection Research Lab that was funded by DARPA. And what you're talking about is this notion of flooding the attacker with these highly believable decoy credentials and personal or PII information that force them to really not be sure in terms of what's real and what's not. And to your point, they have to actually go back to the spoof site to actually be able to go through the credentials to see what's real, what's not. Even if it's automated, it still can be fairly cost prohibitive and time consuming. Now, that logic, I think, makes a lot of sense. However, that assumes that you have a total blanket, meaning you have full coverage. Your services and then your clients represent a small percentage of the total IPs that are out there. So they may abandon that particular campaign, but they may move on to something else that doesn't have or have similar protection around this deception technology. How do you address that?
So it's a problem, obviously, just the scale of the internet. And this, in my view, is like good hygiene. Just like any enterprise, any individual that has laptop or a host system, you must have antivirus running on it. That's just basic good hygiene. This technology that I'm describing as well is also part of that best practice of good hygiene, and everyone should use it. So, for example, when filtering is done by whatever means, whether it's proxy infrastructure or email filtering and so forth, the collection of malicious URLs, there are, of course, advanced threat intel companies that provide this source of information. But my view is to stop these kinds of attacks, it's not just passive filtering and defending and trying to hold the bullets back. There should be a more active, a proactive response, a mitigation strategy where attackers now pay a price, change the economics. So everyone should be in the game of, if I find a spoof site, don't just filter it and just notify everyone else it's malicious. Go and hack it back in a non-lethal way, not attack the server to bring it down, but just flood it with lies.
Yeah.
After all, everything that we're talking about on the internet is virtual world that we've architected. And why should one assume that when we provide information, it's truth? It's not. We can provide falsehood and then create for the adversary a much more harder problem. So right now, they enjoy the freedom of attacking and netting the data that they steal is purely, valuable to them. Make it invaluable to them. And everyone should do this. It's good hygiene.
Yeah. Now the tool that you guys are using, I think you guys call it Bot Swindler. Now, why not make Bot Swindler available to consumers on a freemium basis, so that the purpose is try to flood your capabilities so that every consumer in the world could in fact protect themselves, because ultimately, like I said, the risk is on the consumer side, but the financial liability is on the enterprise side.
That's right. So from your lips to God's ears, if we had a technology that people would be willing to buy and have to deploy, and that's a very, very hard problem to get people to be aware of it, to download it, to install it, and then use it easily. For what we are dealing with now, the biggest losses and the biggest problems are it's the banking sites, financial institution sites, and the retail sites. And like any other new innovative technology, you have to have a go-to-market strategy where you could provide the evidence and the proof that the technology is effective and works, and from there grow and deploy more broadly. So to start with, to get consumers to trust it and consumers to be aware of it and consumers to buy it or download it, that's a very big daunting problem. But the problem is where people have their relationships with the large enterprises. That's where we start, because they are under tremendous pressure right now, because not only do they suffer billions of dollars in losses from customers losing their credentials or having their credentials stolen, but they now also have to worry about the fines that GDPR and other regulations now will impose upon them. So the risks have grown much more rapidly for the large enterprises.
Right.
So now is the time.
Just for clarity, I'm not talking about challenging your go-to-market strategy. I think it's sound. The question is it possible to have a lightweight open source where it just becomes pervasively available for people, so that the cost of barrier or adoption becomes almost zero?
Oh, technically, it's certainly feasible to build such a technology, and the first ones who would probably download and use it are the adversaries. And so the key is, and you said it yourself earlier, the key is to generate highly believable data that you're feeding the adversary. So whatever the technology is, it is not going to reveal the data that'll be delivered to them, but it will reveal how it's delivered to them.
Yeah. So that's a really great transition to talk about the fact that just like DARPA and Columbia, of course, and then Allure Security are investing heavily into these proactive types of technologies. Mm-hmm. The bad guys are also using a lot of automation and AI, and they continue to invest into their technologies to scale, to increase their effectiveness of their attacks, and ultimately to circumvent. So, I mean, I think some of the latest finding that at least I'm seeing is some are even able to overcome multi-factor, including some of the tokenization aspects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So this is not new.
This is not new. It's a cat and mouse. So
yes.
They're always going to be trying to get ahead, and you guys are trying to get ahead.
Yeah.
And for you, somebody who's always kind of embraced R&D and have tremendous amount of patents and research, what's your belief system in terms of security? Because I think one of the things that you mentioned is this notion of proactivity. Many enterprises feel that once they have a certain stack from the typical security companies, that they're safe. What's the positioning or messaging that you would give to them around feeling safe?
Oh man, my long-term dream is that the internet should be safe, and it's not. But again, I think the primary focus and what drives me is this very intelligent use of deception, and why I feel the cat and mouse game that will change is because we can control the economics. We can impact the economics, and that's the key. And that's not what most people think of when they think about safety and security or risk. But the problem is because the monetization of the attacks that attackers have very cleverly automated in scale using technologies like AI, machine learning, and so forth. Adversarial machine learning has been around in the security space for quite a few years, and they're very effective at it. But what's missing is the realization that they're after data. And it's the data that we now have to concentrate on to figure out, and I think we have figure out a way to have a conversation with the attacker directly and just lie to them. And when you lie to them, what do? And that changes the entire balance of power that they have over us now. So I'm committed to demonstrating that this actually is an effective way of treating the security problem. And it's quite new. Deception has been used in many contexts for many years, but has not been applied in scale in this context. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like I'm having a CIA conversation around espionage. But in the case of, states like, let's say, North Korea or Iran that are heavily sanctioned, and a big portion of their GDP, certainly in the case of North Korea, is actually IP theft as well as spoofing and phishing, including the stealing, private keys of Bitcoins. So they are heavily incented to try to gain those financial economics because of the fact that they don't necessarily have alternatives or other means to generate GDP growth. So do you believe that this deception approach is sufficient for them to stop their behavior, or would they simply just look for different opportunities?
I think it can have a huge impact on reducing their campaigns. Stopping it is, I think, a fool's errand. I mean, people are people, and throughout history, they'll always find a way. But right now, for the most part, there's no cost involved in what they do. And by including now a cost in their operations that dramatically increases their cost, it's going to change the game. And then they'll just have to see over time how that game has changed. We may be able to herd them into a context which is much more controllable. But right now, they have free reign. And we should stop that, and we can stop that.
But just one more point, and then I'll move on to a different topic, is that through the use of automation on their side, they could, in fact, become more efficient over time so that their marginal cost of being able to validate true or not true on the real side becomes cheaper, so that at some point they say that it just makes sense to continue that regardless.
So, of course, but on our side, just generate more bogus material. Just keep them, keep shoveling it.
I love it. This is such a great conversation. Let's switch conversation, talk about the EU's revised payment service directive.
Yeah.
What is it, and why should we be concerned?
So essentially what they've done is what the banks forever have always wanted to be the middleman in any kind of financial transaction. This is a disintermediation of the banks, and they were always trying to fight this. But now your bank account is your individual owned asset, even though it's being held and operated by a bank. You now have the opportunity for a third party to be your bank, to be your payment system, to be your credit card processor. And that could be Google and Facebook or any other third party that pops up. So your bank account is no longer under the control of or the exclusive management of your bank. That's a huge opportunity for third-party companies who provide more convenient services for all of us. But at the same time, it creates a new opportunity for spoofing, because now all of these third parties, which will provide a web interface, for example, to those services that they provide for your payments, they're going to be spoofed, they're going to be attacked. And so it simply increases the range of opportunity for the attackers. The attack surface, the number of additional websites that have real value behind them, increases. So now they have, why bother just focusing on Bank X when I have these other 100 third-party companies that I can focus on? And that's where most of the population is going. That's where my victims are, my sheep, and that's what's going to happen. They will be attacked regularly to steal credentials and break into these third-party providers. The other thing I should mention is many will be younger companies, and they won't be as sophisticated as the older companies that have been at this game for a long time, that have very sophisticated internal fraud units, and they have analytics, and they have security people. And so they're going to probably have systems that are not as well secured or well managed. And so there's going to be even greater opportunities for losses. So if you don't protect your web interface and protect your customers from being tricked, you're going to suffer heavy losses. So the young companies that jump into this space, be aware that you're going to be targeted almost instantly by the large-scale attack community.
Yeah.
The attack surface now is just too juicy for them to ignore.
Right. So great warnings. And of course, for you guys, that also means almost a kind of another huge opportunity for you guys to show value. The last topic that we want to discuss and wrap it up here today is that spoofing, oftentimes we think in terms of privacy, PII data, financial transactions, but rarely do we actually think about it in the context of politics, free press, or democracy. How is phishing being used to attack elections and essentially democratic movements around the globe, such as the one in the U.S. Leading up to 2020 U.S. presidential elections?
Well, it's evident that once you steal a credential of a significant politician or the staff of that politician, you get access to whatever the secrets are that those credentials provide. And so, again, email systems with web interfaces, easy to spoof. So tricking somebody to give up their credentials, didn't that happen in the last election cycle to a number of different politicians? They're certainly targeted, and they're targeted by nation states, as you well know, as well as other political groups. And so they suffer the same threat that financial institutions and retail institutions do. Just grab the credentials, steal the credentials, victimize and trick. And now that you have access to the email flows or to the particular cloud stores that the political parties are using, you have a cache of very valuable information. What can you do with the information? It's pretty obvious, right? But also, if you're really bad at managing your own assets, there's no reason to believe that a more active attack can happen by placing bogus information by the attacker into the cloud store, for example, to trick and confuse the staffers of the political party. So this is a very, very big issue, and detecting spoofing and detecting credential theft and preventing this kind of activity, or at least reducing it and changing the economics, in my view, is a way to provide more security and more safety for all of us, including in the political realm.
So on that note, today we've been joined by Professor Salvatore Stolfo, CTO of Allure Security. Thank you for joining, Professor.
Thank you very much for your time.